And we are now recording. Okay, my name's RT Brown. I'm with the BDCC, and this is the 11th session of the BDCC Business Resiliency webinar series. It's June 5th. This morning, my temperature ranged from 96.5 to 97.3, according to the funny little thermometer that we have up by the front desk. It's never been above 98.6. In fact, I don't think it's ever been 98.6. So I don't quite understand it. Let's see, I've admitted people, I've disabled the waiting room, I've hit record. And now I'm going to just do a very brief overview of some of the features of Zoom, which I know everyone is probably used to, but sometimes it's a good reminder. If you hover your mouse over your picture and you see the ellipse, you can rename yourself. So I'm going to put my organization. Sometimes that's helpful. So feel free to do that. If you select the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, the chat window will appear, and then they did an update to Zoom. I think this happened this morning. I'm looking for the little raise hand icon. Does anyone else see it? That's often useful during the questions. But there's some icons. There's like a thumbs up, thumbs down that you can use.
I see it, RT.
Okay.
If you look at if you do the chats, right at the top where you can see some of the attendees.
Yeah.
That's the line. I can see that raised hand. Yes, no, go slower, go faster, and more. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. So if you have a question, indicate one of those, and that way I'll be able to see you. Oh, and then, yeah, Robin says also in participants. So again, welcome. Today we have Ted Brady, who is the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, as well as Susan Mazza, the Supervisory Economic Development Specialist for the District Office of the SBA. I know Susan's here. We heard Susan just a moment ago, and I'm looking for Ted. Does anyone see Ted?
I'm here.
You are here, and you're unmuted. So thank you to one of my colleagues for unmuting you, because it wasn't me. Thank you. I know you guys are just crazy busy, but I really appreciate your joining us today. And I was hoping you might be able to give us, as best you can, some updates on what's working, what the programs that are working their way through the legislature. Typically, we have some local representatives, but I received note Tristan, who's usually in the webinar, is not able to join us because he's in a committee meeting discussing the legislation for these programs. So Ted, I'm going to toss it to you to give us some updates. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. And hello, Southern Vermont. What a beautiful day. Okay, so I'm going to touch on three things. One is restart real quick, restart guidance, just so people know that's happening. Two is the status of the economic mitigation recovery package. And I think three is just where we think and what we're doing to get ready for that. So one, restart. I think a lot of people probably saw today, there are actually three big announcements. Announcement one, indoor dining. Indoor dining returns with 25% capacity on Monday. So get ready to support your local restaurants. Issue two, or restart two, lodging. Lodging goes to 50% capacity on Monday. Issue three, a drastic change to our quarantine requirements. Drastic is in everyday life for most Vermonters, especially those of you in border communities. Less drastic for kind of where it takes us in the economy right now, but it's a path forward. And so folks know what we're doing is the agency will be working with the Department of Financial Regulation and the Department of Health each week to designate counties across New England and New York that are non-quarantine counties, counties across the region that have a similar COVID-19 active caseload as Vermont. So when you think of that, it's most of Maine, except for the Portland area. It's most of New Hampshire, except for, blanking on the county names, but Manchester and Nashua. It's most of upstate New York, north of Syracuse. It is every adjoining county to the state of Vermont. So technically, people were supposed to be quarantining when they crossed that border unless they were commuting across that border on a daily basis as part of their life. With the new guidance, you don't need to quarantine when people come in, and you as a Vermonter can travel freely across those safe counties. We'll be updating those counties on our webpage at accd.vermont.gov every Monday. If your county falls out of attainment and you're in Vermont, you don't need to go home right away. But if your county falls out of attainment before you come to Vermont, you're asked not to come to Vermont unless you quarantine. Other big news in quarantine. So I'm sure that makes no sense because I've just said it verbally, but here it is, just to reiterate that point. We are designated counties where you no longer need to quarantine if you travel to, and where they don't need to quarantine if they come to Vermont. 2, the quarantine requirement as of June 15th can be completed in your home state. So if you plan to come to Vermont for your vacation and you live in New York City, you can quarantine in your home in New York City for 7 days, get a test, and drive straight to Vermont. And you don't need to complete your quarantine when you get here. Third issue on quarantine, I think I've got that right. When you quarantine in Vermont now, if you don't want to do that and you want to quarantine in Vermont, like let's say you fly here because you can't drive here, you can quarantine in a lodging operation or a campground and get a test after 7 days. That was not an option. That will be as of June 15th. So those are the big quarantine changes. Those have a drastic impact on lodging, as you can probably imagine. This increases the number of people that lodging operations can serve. It doesn't hit all of them, but it's a big increase. And it also gives us a path forward, and this is the really important part. Our intention within a few weeks is to reevaluate whether the 400 cases per million is the right metric, and if we should go up to 650 or higher, so that we can open up more counties to travel in July. Okay, I'm gonna pause there, take a breath, and move to the next issue, which is the restart package.
Hey, Ted, yeah. Can I ask on that topic before we move on? There's a question in the chat about Massachusetts. Do you know if Franklin County, Massachusetts, just south of us, within the attainment area?
Every county adjoining Vermont is in attainment.
Okay, great.
And
so if somebody quarantines at either a campground or a lodging facility, and after 10 days they want to get a test, do you know what how do they get a hold of that test, or is it, is it just reaching out to medical facilities within the region?
The state is still doing these pop-up testing sites, and we're encouraging people to use those pop-up testing sites. On the Department of Health site, they post when and where they are.
Great.
And to go and get a test through those sites.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you.
Jen is just pointing something out in the chat, so I'm double checking this, because this morning I checked in every county adjoining. I wonder if things changed since we did the math. Yeah, so Jen is pointing out that both Franklin and Berkshire counties are yellow on the map. So I would not be surprised if that math changed since last night, because we updated the numbers this morning. So I apologize for giving bad information, but the good news is they are not that far off of 400 cases per million. And I'd have to check to see if they're trending downwards, and we will update this map every Monday by 5 p.m.
Okay.
Sorry for the bad information.
Thank you. Okay, you were gonna switch gears.
Yeah, let me switch gears. Let's talk about the recovery package. So as you know, 4-part recovery package. We've talked about this a lot. Technical assistance, $5 million to help businesses change the way they do business, access new resources. $5 million for marketing to try to help organizations stimulate more economic activity in their regions. We'd grant out about $4 million, $3.5 million to organizations around the state to try to help them create stimulus programs like the downtown organization in Brattleboro is already doing. $50 million to help housing and landlords and rent arrearage. And then the big piece was $250 million in economic incentives and economic grants directly to businesses that could demonstrate 50% economic impact for any 4 weeks during the COVID closure. And those grants were meant to be up to $62,000, $62,500, based on 2.5% of your annual revenue. Any business or nonprofit organization that could prove that they had economic damage and that the PPP program and EIDL left them with fixed costs that were unmet would be eligible for these grant dollars. We'd intended to administer it through a tax program where you just have to go fill out a form and tax, and they'd send a payment based on your sales tax revenue, meals and rooms tax revenue, alcohol tax revenue. For businesses that don't pay those, the idea was you'd go to VITA or to your local regional development corporation. You'd get access to the same grant dollars, and you'd potentially have access to additional loan dollars. The legislature in the House, they've cut that in a third, and they're proposing to put out $70 million. In the Senate, they've cut it by more than half and are proposing to put out $100 million. They've also increased the demonstration for economic impact to 75% economic impact. They've also been more generous. They want to go from 2.5% revenue to 5% revenue. They have shelved the technical assistance program, they've shelved the marketing program, and they've shelved the housing program as what they're calling phase 2, so that they want to move the grants. God bless them. They are working as hard as they can to move these grants first so that we can get these grants out in June. Blessing and a curse, right? By moving it faster, they've reduced the dollar figures, they've changed the program significantly from what we proposed, but we do acknowledge that they're doing God's work in trying to get this, get to yes. I don't know how it all shakes out. We don't think that's enough money. We don't understand the logic between doing 2 phases of business grants. We also don't believe that going from 50% to 75% is going to cull a lot of businesses. And yet they're going to cut us by more than a half of what we proposed. And those numbers were based on factual data analysis that our teams did. So we're very nervous that what is moving to the legislature simply isn't enough and changes the program too much. So we would welcome folks communicating with their legislators what they feel about that. Pause there and go to my last thing, which is, what do we see happening, or what are we doing to get ready? The agency is moving ahead as if one of these things is going to move, so that the second we get approval, we can either use the tax mechanism or we can stand up our own mechanism at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development in partnership with the RDCs and others to distribute the money. So no matter what happens, we are preparing so that when the bill gets signed, we are 2/3 of the way there to launching a program. I'll pause there and take any questions and turn it over to the real money, which is Susan Mazza.
Ted, you mentioned that the proposals that you folks had put forth and was backed up by some research and data. So if folks were to reach out to their legislators, what are key factors that really could resonate with someone with regards to how diminishing the proposed programs by a third, what will the impact of that be?
Sure. Distill it down, fewer companies will get grants. The grants will be bigger for those fewer companies, and more companies will have to wait. We believe that we'll lose dozens, if not hundreds, of businesses by the time phase 2 gets launched.
Okay.
And let me just tell you the data we used. We did a survey, as you've heard. We demonstrated a $350 million annual economic impact. Our research analyst estimates $1 billion monthly economic impact on the economic activity. And we've done some research with tax, and we've looked at sales tax revenue, meals and rooms tax revenue, alcohol tax revenue, and tried to estimate what percent business is off, and then done some calculations. And tranche 1 with tax, the plan was to give 12,000 businesses payments based on their tax revenue and their previous year tax payments. So that was $100 million of the proposal.
Right.
Excuse me. I'll get that more.
Okay, so if that's cut down to a third, that's
it's pretty
4,000.
Yeah. And if you increase the grant dollar, it simply will not. It will not go. There will not be enough money, and there will be a lot of people who.
Right. We have a question in the chat. For Airbnb and VRBO hosts, the companies submit the lodging tax directly to Vermont. Will the individuals running the lodging be credited, in quotes, with the lodging tax so they'll be eligible for grants? Has that come up in discussion, Ted?
So I'm trying to figure this out. If you are a business that pays the lodging tax, I see what it's saying here. So technically Airbnb and VRBO are the ones paying the lodging tax. So,
but the individual property owners, are they? Yeah.
So I don't know how that'll work. I'll check with tax. We've talked about the short-term rentals being eligible, so I'll have to figure that one out. Thanks for flagging that. I'll try to get back to RT.
Yeah, thank you, Ted.
We don't intend to give VRBO and Airbnb a bailout. But the people that depend on that platform, I think our intention is to treat them on par as revenue generating businesses.
Right. Okay. I know you're not, I know you're a wizard, but there are bounds. Any ideas about timelines for this stuff?
The legislature said they're going to try to get this out by June 15th.
June 15th, okay.
So
okay.
The first round, if they do that, we think we can get the first round of grants out within 2 weeks.
Okay.
We think we'll be able to get some of the grants through the application process out within those 2 weeks, but not all of them. So there will be an application portal set up in a way for people to apply for grants within 2 weeks of passage.
Okay. Well, Ted, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I want to thank you very much for carving out some time for us. Your haircut looks great. And thank you for being a champion for small businesses all around the state. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
All right, Susan.
I'm up.
You are up.
I am up. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, there's been a lot of news about PPP lately. I'm hoping that you might be able to give us some updates and maybe also touch on forgiveness and maybe how some of those changes might impact the process of forgiveness and so forth.
Well, part of me wishes this would be next week, because considering it just got signed today,
Yeah,
it's a little hard to be too conclusive with what it all means.
yeah.
But let me kind of start at the beginning. One, just to let everybody know, if they didn't already, there's plenty of more money available in the PPP program. So people can apply to that all the way up to the end of June, as long as there is money, and there is money. And it will last at least for, my guess is at least a couple more weeks. You know, who knows? It's going much slower now because the dollar amounts are much, much smaller. So it's taking longer to get through what's left of the funding, but it's still available. And so, I mean, the averages here in Vermont have gone from about $105,000 on average down to about 70,000, and getting smaller all the time. Similarly, the EIDL program is still taking applications for ag businesses only. That continues to be the case. They have not reopened it to other applicants at this time. I have no idea if they will. They are continuing to process applications because there have been so many. They are still working through the backlog. So far, Vermont has seen about 1,600 come through in terms of numbers, and approximately, that's representing approximately $112 million.
Susan, that
Yep.
would
Yep.
are value-added food manufacturers included within ag or not? Just to be clear.
No. Ag in this sector really means the farmer.
Yep.
So the people who add the value, they were already eligible and could have applied at the beginning. EIDL has been around for decades, and usually in a physical disaster situation, and they have never actually been allowed, ag businesses have never been allowed to apply to EIDL before now. Because typically in a physical disaster, there were different ag agencies that provided disaster funding directly to those farms. So that's how they were being served. But in this case, they aren't being served that way. So that's why in the second tranche of funding, they made the ag businesses eligible. That's more or less why they opened up the portal for them, to be able to give them a chance to get into the queue and to being processed. It is still a situation where there's a lot of frustration because there's a lot of lack of transparency. We at the district office don't have the ability to see into the program or into the platform at all. So until they get approved and closed and kind of out the back end, we can't see anything in the process, where they are, where they stand, if they're being worked on. So everything that we do has to operate through the Office of Disaster Assistance. They are the ones who manage the program and make the decisions, and they also make all the underwriting decisions. But a lot more are coming through, which we're really happy about. And we can help people to some extent with questions if they are being faced with, like, if their turnaround time is so long, they're really concerned, which it has been long. So if they really want to get a sense for what might be normal and what not, they can call the district office. But the first recommendation I would have is to first call the Disaster Servicing Center to get a status update, and maybe get some more information if possible by waiting a little bit longer and getting to a second level of phone support that utilizes more experienced people who might be able to get more information for them. But we can help in other respects, or at the very least, explaining maybe when they do get something, what does it mean? How does it work? Why is this amount and not that amount? So we may be able to give at least some guidance there at the district office level. But the Office of Disaster Assistance is really in charge of how the system is handled and how the decisions are made based on a standard set of rules and regs, but they've been somewhat modifying them to try and make sure that as many businesses can get serviced as possible, which in some cases means borrowers will end up with less money than they were hoping. But that is something that the ODA, Office of Disaster Assistance, has to manage. They always have to manage within their resources.
Okay. Hey, Susan, before we jump into maybe just the overview of the proposed or the now signed PPP changes, there's a question in the chat about EIDL while we're talking about EIDL. George asks, the first loan.
Yeah, I see the question.
Oh, great, awesome, thank you.
So if it's yeah, you don't have to make a payment. They are deferred until the 12th month. They are accruing interest. They do accrue interest. So if you pay the money back, the quicker you do it, the less interest you'll be paying because it will accrue over that time. And anything, even in pieces of it, if you didn't want to use all of it and you returned half of it, that means that there'd be that much less of a balance the interest would be accruing on. So anything that you can do, and there are no prepayment penalties at all. The interest does apply, and it will only accrue based on the outstanding balance. So again, if you take the full amount, you decide you don't want it, you can return that portion that you haven't taken, and at that point, your balance will have been reduced. The other thing I want to point out is at the point that an applicant gets notified by email that they can go into the portal and open up they're basically it's a portal where they can go in, find out the status of their loan, how much they're authorized for, they can get their loan documentation and things of that nature. That process actually gives them the ability of lowering the dollar amount. So there's actually like a little gauge, which will say this is the maximum of you can have, but you can take that gauge and lower it. And anything below, for example, 25,000, there's no personal guarantee and no collateral. So you'll find people who are close to that will want to ramp that down, obviously.
Yeah,
but that is the opportunity. So if somebody does have something like that and they don't want to take the full amount right off the bat, and they know that, they can reduce it at that first stage. In which case, none of that will have been accrued because they wouldn't have closed on the loan yet. So they'll just be lowering the dollar amount there. So that can be helpful, at least to know. But again, there's no prepayment penalty. So if you do take the full amount and you find after 6 months or so that you're really in a position, you're much better off, you're able to really reduce the dollar amount of the balance, you can do that at any time, after you've closed, of course. You can do that at any time, which is going to limit the amount that you're going to be owing in interest right off the bat.
Okay.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, thanks. Let's just take one more question before we jump into the general overview of the PPP changes.
Yep.
Robin has his hand up. I'm going to unmute Robin.
Hey, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
I think so.
It may be like this was more.
A TED question?
Yeah, it was just kind of looking at, we're in an interesting phase where we kind of fit all 3 qualifications. So I was trying to figure out which one we should be. Where we sell alcohol, so we're meals and rooms tax, so we should be in that first bunch.
Right.
But we're also entertainment, which kind of fit in the second area. And then we're also by employees and sales qualify for the micro business. So
Interesting.
Well, is your question which loan program would make the most sense?
Yeah,
I think Robin's asking about the programs that are working, with their way through the legislature.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, the most of the businesses that are eligible for EIDL are also eligible for the PPP. It's just a matter of which program and how it operates makes the most sense. But no, you're right, RT. It sounds like, Robin, what you're talking about are some of the different options that are going to be available to you at the state level.
Right.
And I can't speak to that. So, and until they actually get everything set up and passed, who knows? I know in our programs, until it actually gets written in kind of a rule book and a guideline book, it's hard to make decisions prior to seeing what it actually ends up being in reality when it opens up for applications. So,
Robin, sorry I didn't get to you earlier.
That's right.
So Susan, maybe if you could give folks an overview of the changes of the PPP
Okay.
Flexibility Act, that'd be great.
Okay, a couple of things I just want to mention right off the bat, because an awful lot of the rules that are in place now are relevant and remain relevant in the process for forgiveness. And to at least to try and help that, I am started up just this morning conducting daily webinars every morning at 9 o'clock that will cover the forgiveness process, how to do it, how to apply, all of that information, because it's confusing. And it is, I would tell you, I'm not surprised when I see the same participants listening more than once, because sometimes that's what it takes to be able to really understand. But that said, I also will be incorporating the changes, and now that they're signed. And the one thing I do know is that because it's signed, SBA and Treasury now has to take that and interpret it and put out guidance so that we know how to implement it. Because some of those changes are going to be like, okay, well then what happens between 8 and 24 weeks? I mean, do you have the option? Is it one or the other? There are a number of questions that have already been raised that really need to be fleshed out. But that said, some of the issues that are going to be changing are the 8-week monitoring period that we've been talking about all along, will be potentially extended to 24 weeks. Now, what that means, that's normally a time period that you have to both pay the costs and then look at those being forgiven. But then you're also looking at that time period for FTE counts, full-time employee counts, and compensation. So the question's been raised to me already. If you meet those qualifications and you spend the money appropriately after the 8 weeks, but before 24 weeks, can you apply then? I don't know. But right now, I do know that I think different organizations are recommending that if you meet the terms on the 8 weeks, don't wait. You know, if you can do it earlier, you want to be able to apply as soon as you can. You may want to stay with that 8-week window. The other thing that potentially is or will be changing is the 75-25 split between payroll versus non-payroll portion of the loan, which has been pretty traumatic for some people to grasp, given the circumstances of the sheltering in place and the stay-at-home orders, and how it's really seriously impacting some businesses. Part of this moving to the 24-week will also be allowing a 60% to 40% split. The downside of that is that I believe the interpretation is that that is what they're calling a cliff. It means you have to spend 60% or you get nothing forgiven. I don't know if that's true. I want to see the guidance when it comes out, but I know that there's a number of organizations that are interpreting it that way. So it's almost like you might have the option of going with the 8 weeks, in which case you have the 75-25, but if you don't make the 75 and you make 70 or 60%, it means part of it's going to be forgiven anyway. But with the 60-40, it makes it look as if you've got to do 60 or you're not going to get anything repaid, forgiven. So that's something to kind of watch out for. The other thing is that there was a safe harbor date, which allowed businesses that had had a reduction in their employees between mid-February and late April could get their employee count back up to by June 30th. Even if they didn't do it during the monitoring period of 8 weeks, if they were able to do it by June 30th, what this safe harbor said is then the discounting that may take place because you didn't make it during the 8-week period will be waived. So it's a safe harbor. So normally the 8-week period would determine your FTE count. And if you weren't able to get back up to the pre-pandemic FTE count by the end of that 8 weeks, there normally is a reduction proportionately. So if it's a 10% drop in your FTE, you would be taking those payroll costs and reducing it by 10%. It's the way the rules are now. But this safe harbor did exist and still does to some extent, that if by the end of June, that same employer was able to get the FTE count back up to the pre-pandemic level, that discounting that I just talked about would not take place. You're still left with the cost that you incurred, and that's all that you could ask to be forgiven, which would probably be less because your FTE count wasn't that as high, theoretically. You didn't have as many employees, you probably weren't incurring those many costs. But right now, they're talking about this June 30 date being moved to December 31st. So now it looks like the safe harbor will be December 31st. Now, obviously, if you get your 8 weeks taken care of, you get everything forgiven ahead of time, that 12/31 is irrelevant anyway. And I believe, I keep saying I believe, because this is other people's interpretations that look very close. I just need to keep restating the fact that my agency still has to put out some guidance here. It looks like that June 30th safe harbor may or may not any longer exist. It gets moved to that December 31st. I don't know if that's a correct interpretation. I would like to see it be that if you keep the 8-week criteria and you don't want to move into that 24-week, it would be nice if that June 30th safe harbor still applied to you, so you wouldn't have to wait until 12/31 to meet that safe harbor.
So Susan, I appreciate your saying the I believe statement.
I believe that.
Yeah, but it's still helpful because what you're doing is flagging what we and folks can be keeping our eyes on.
Yes.
So it's still super helpful.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask though, maybe I should ask this at the end, but basically what I'm getting at is, with these, with the greater flexibility, and you haven't touched on yet the fact that it's going from a 2-year payback to potentially a 5-year payback, which I know you'll touch on in a minute. PPP is, in my eyes, can become more accessible and reasonable for some businesses. So would it be possible for somebody to either revisit their application if they think they could benefit from it?
Well, I don't know what you mean by revisit it.
Let me.
The issue we have, RT, is there's a lot of people who got their loans right off the bat as fast as they could because they thought the money would be gone, and they were right. It went really fast at the beginning, and they are diligently trying to meet the 8-week guidelines. And in some cases, the businesses that are doing that are really challenged because they haven't been open.
Yeah.
And the theory is by the time they can open, it'll be past the 8 weeks.
I think the use case I'm trying to explore is maybe it's more appropriate to say a business that maybe was approved for PPP but was kind of scared off by it and turned it down. Could they go back and reapply under the new guidelines? If
they did not get a loan, if they started applying but then withdrew it before they closed it, they can apply.
Okay.
There still is money available. I think what would happen is if they closed it, returned the money, I don't think that they would be able to. I think the issue is as long as they didn't close and get the money and the bank canceled it and so forth, they should be okay to do that. They'd want to make sure that that lender who approved that canceled it. Now, also keep in mind that the banks are required to close within 10 days.
Okay.
So they should probably already know where they stand. The one thing I think is maybe helping businesses with this extension is those businesses who maybe even recently got the funding have been afraid to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Very afraid to use it. We get that question all the time. Oh my God, I don't want to make a mistake. I want to use it the right way. And so some businesses are going to be not that far down that 8-week path. And at this point, they can look at some of these rules and see, well, what would it mean if I followed that set of rules rather than trying to meet that original set of rules I thought I was going to be working under.
Okay.
Revisiting, yes, that makes perfect sense. To really take a look at, okay, what are the regulations giving me the opportunity to do now? What makes the most sense? Some businesses might even choose to reduce their payroll for a little while until they are more fully open, and then have more available of that funding later on when they can bring the people back in, if they have this much longer window. I could see that very much happening.
Okay.
The issue, of course, is who knows what's going to take place in 2 months, 3 months these days. You are going to have to try and budget that out a little bit, because you're still left with the same dollar amount as you had been. There's no change to the amount of money that you can get with these loans. So if you already have the loan, that's what you're left with, that balance, that loan amount. And if you haven't applied yet, the calculation rules have not changed at all. So none of this speaks to new applications. It all is talking about the forgiveness and the rules you have to more or less live by once the loan is closed.
Okay. So I derailed you a little bit. You were
It's okay.
going over the just
Okay.
overall sort of
Yep.
general proposed.
The other thing is there is going to be a little bit more wiggle room for an employer if they have a hard time getting their people back in the shop, for lack of a better word. If they're employees that they want, I hope my husband doing the lawn outside isn't going to bother
Fine.
anybody.
Totally
Good,
fine.
because I can't close the loans. I'm in the upstairs bedroom with no air conditioning, so it's
Oof.
pretty darn hot. I just have a crazy dog downstairs, so if I'm down there, it'll be even louder. So what we're saying is employers have an ability to document it when they are trying to rehire one of their people they've had to lay off. And if that person refuses to come back, yes, you can go find another person to hire, but also if you document that you've tried and they have refused, and you've given the opportunity for a similar pay and a similar hours and they refuse, that kind of documentation can mean that that lack of that person, that FTE, won't impact the borrower's ability for gaining the forgiveness that they're hoping for. They won't be penalized by it. There's additional flexibility with this new rule about additional ways that that might take place. Some additional flexibility, one of which, for example, is if you are required, and I believe they say by federal guidelines, that your business cannot be open to the extent that you would like it to be because of CDC guidelines or something like that. And it's federal guidelines, not state. So if all of a sudden the federal came out and said, okay, everybody's at 50% capacity, that's going to have a serious impact. There's no reason you would bring everybody back. Those kind of impacts can limit your liability if you don't get that FTE count back. So there are some areas there that are more flexible. The other one that you mentioned, of course, he's out on this side of the yard now. I can hear him.
It's fine. We don't hear it. Or at least I don't.
The other thing is you mentioned it is talking about an extension of the 2 years to a 5-year. Yep. So instead of a 2-year term, it's a 5-year term. Still at 1% according to the rules, I believe, yes. And there's more guidance in there that have to do with when a borrower has to actually put forward a forgiveness application, and if they don't, what will happen and things like that. So there's a little bit more filling, there's a lot more filling out to be done when it comes to how this works with the existing program. So what do existing borrowers, do they have the option of choosing one or the other, the 8-week or the 24? And if so, what does that mean? What does that look like? That's what I mean by the SBA and Treasury really have to come out with the clarification as to how to actually put that all in place. So those are some of the differences. Some of the tax deductibility, like I can't really speak to, but there are supposedly going to be some changes with the ability to defer your taxes, I believe. I haven't been paying that much attention to those. I've been more concerned with the FTE counts and the compensation balances. So as I say, once this comes out and gets more flushed out, my agency will put out guidance as soon as, and I will speak to some of this in more detail during my webinars, but I'll also be pointing out what we do know and what we don't know when I do it, because it's, again, it's not until you actually see it in print that you're going to know.
Did the president sign the act?
One of my senior leaders sent an email out just this afternoon. I did not think it had, and he said it had.
Oh,
so
okay.
We'll see.
And before how long, do you have any idea how long it takes for a new interim final rule or to be released?
Crystal ball time.
Yeah.
I would think, well, the agency has always known all of these guidances shouldn't dilly-dally because everybody's working under their rules now, and people are making decisions now based on, because they're right at the end of their 8 weeks, some of the first ones that close. They're really close, and they need to know what to do. Now, there is still plenty of room. I mean, somebody who's gone through that 8 weeks, if they're not able to meet those guidelines, they may want to hold off doing anything until they see more of what these rules are going to look like. They don't have to run out the door and apply right now, especially if you don't think you're going to meet the rules that are in place now, the 8-week window and the June 30th harbor. If you do think that you've already spent the money appropriately, you've kept your FTE up, you've kept your compensation levels up, you have all the documentation, there would be no reason to hesitate and just go for it. Plus, you'll be one of the first people in that banker's queue, and they are going to be overwhelmed with businesses coming in looking for these applications. But if you haven't been able to meet it, I wouldn't rush right out, even if you've spent the money, because you may, for example, be able to get your FTE count up by a certain date that will then take care of at least a portion of that discounting effect. Again, once it's out more fully, it would be easier for somebody to talk to a business about where they're at, what their numbers look like, and what should they do. At that point, we might be able to guide them a little bit with, you'd be better off holding off before you put the application in to see if you can do X, Y, and Z. And that's the hard part. But I'm really expecting the interim rule. I shouldn't say this because I'm always wrong. I would say within a week. I would say within a week, because I think they've already seen a lot of this legislation and we're already thinking about what might happen. Because the first one got passed and the second one got passed. My understanding is there were no changes to the House's bill.
Yeah, so Jen, Stephanie, and CJ posted that the president signed it about 3 hours ago. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
So as I said, I knew as of this morning it hadn't been, and then I saw something that said it had, but then we are, of course, being counseled not to put anything out too quickly about it because we have to see our own internal guidance.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. And like I said earlier, you help us sort of flag what we should be keeping our eyes on. There's some questions in the chat. I was hoping, can you see those?
Let me see.
So the first one is from Paul Krautwurst of 802 Fitness. Hi, Paul. How are you? Hope you're well. I'm hesitating on reading it. If you can see it.
I'm 220. Recent one.
250. 250 is the timestamp. So down a little bit further.
I'm looking
It starts
at
with so I'll just read
Okay.
it. My question is for how PPP and PUA.
Oh, I see it.
are-
I see it
are-
now. I see it now.
All right.
It's a long one. The question
Yeah.
is for how PPP and PUI are coordinated. I own a gym and we stopped seeing people on March 15th, transitioned to online training and continued to make revenue, but lost a lot of members. We collected our PPP loan, which was closed on May 1st. Didn't hit our account until May 21st.
And
I don't understand what that means.
if Paul, if I
think-
provided
yeah.
Paul with your email, could I?
Sure, absolutely.
All right, Paul, I think I'll connect you and Susan directly.
That's often what happens when questions are too long or a little bit too nuanced, is that it's
Yeah.
going to take me a little bit of digging too to get some good guidance for them.
Sure. And then right under that, Prolingua has a
Mhm.
question.
Many instances, 30 hours a week is considered full-time. It's a 40-hour. And actually, to calculate FTE for purposes of the forgiveness, we do know how that's done. That is not a question mark. What it is you're going to add up the hours, let's say, of an employee, and even if they make 48 hours a week, you're going to designate them with one. That's one person. Of 40 hours or more than 40 hours for an individual, that's one person. If it's less than 40 hours, you can either say it's a 60% of a person or a 30% if you want to get to that point, but they are also giving you the ability to say anybody who's a part-timer, you can designate as a 0.5, a 50%. So that you can do,
even if it's
even
a
if it's
0.4?
less,
Gotcha.
even if it's less, it's written right into the application and it's written into the guidance that came out for the forgiveness.
Okay.
So that'll simplify things for people.
Yeah. And then right under that from Donna.
Okay, let me scroll down a little bit farther. Oops, sorry, went too far. It's hard to hold on to this thing so it doesn't go too far. Donna, okay, will there be PPP money for a second go around for those businesses who remained open, get the money and will complete the a second go around, I mean a second application? If that's what you're asking for, Donna, no, there's nothing in the legislation that allows more than one PPP loan for an applicant.
Okay.
Doesn't mean something won't change. Who knows? A lot of things have changed, but no, there's nothing in the new rules and there's nothing in our current rules that allow two. Now the signing, looking down through in rare dispute.
Yeah, those are about the.
Okay.
So I have a question that was emailed to me. So I'm just going to read it. Isn't the 75% to 60% ratio change for the payroll versus other expenses irrelevant if you don't bring your payroll dollars and FTEs back to 100% of your pre-shutdown payroll expenses?
Well, let me explain a little bit about the 75-25 to begin with in the forgiveness period as it currently stands, which I'm assuming would still hold for somebody working on that 8-week turnaround time right now. It's not a black and white. The FTE count needs to come back, and if it's not brought back, that has nothing to do with the dollars. It's two different things. If your FTE count is not what it was pre-pandemic, and let's say you also weren't able to do it at the safe harbor, the lowered amount will be the same amount that you'll be lowering the payroll costs that you did incur. So let's say you had 10% of a reduction in your employee count, in that FTE count. What you'd be doing is you would look at your total payroll costs that you did incur during that 8-week window, and you'd be reducing it by 10%. It still means that you then potentially can have another proportion of it that can go to the non-payroll uses. You're always restricted to no more than 25% of the total forgiveness for non-payroll in the 75-25 split. But there's also the second way your numbers can be impacted which may answer this question, is if your compensation is reduced for an employee by more than 25%. The amount that you have reduced their salary over that 8-week period, the amount below that 25% will further reduce the payroll costs. Now, if you have less people, but you're paying them the same, you're not reducing their compensation because the person's not there anymore. You'll get the hit because of the FTE reduction, but you don't have a hit because they're not getting paid at all. So if you have less people, but you're paying the people the same amount that you were before, there will be no impact, negative impact because of the compensation level. But you still can only request forgiveness based on the amount that you spent, that payroll cost. So you have less people, you probably have a lower payroll cost. So that amount begins that calculation. Because that makes it, it is a gnarly question. It is a gnarly thing to try and explain. So the 60-40, what that may do is then it says out of the, I believe what this thing is saying is that 60% of the loan needs to be going for payroll costs. And I believe it has to be 60% of the loan amount had to be used for that. If not, according to what I believe is the legislation, you won't be allowed any forgiveness. Right now, yes, the expectation is you'll be using 75% of your payroll. And to maximize the amount of your forgiveness, right now, you should be using 75% for payroll costs, because then that amount can also mean you have that additional 25%. So you can potentially get the whole amount forgiven if you do that. But again, it's not a black and white for the 75-25. It sounds like it may be more like that for the 60-40. You're always allowed more than 60, but you couldn't go less than.
Stephanie Bonin has posted in the final question here, Paul's simplified question, which is, can you collect PUA benefits up to your PPP loan origination date, or does it go by when funds hit your account? So I'm not sure if this is a you question or a DOL question.
I get that, although I do realize the difference between approval date and closing should be no more than 10 days anyway. But I don't know if it's going to go by the date of approval or the closing, because our 8-week period that we look at, the monitoring period, is based on the date of closing when you get the money. It's not based on the date of the approval.
But so I think Paul's asking about the pandemic unemployment assistance.
Yeah.
Okay.
So theoretically, I think the PUA should be able to be good up until the point where you get the money, not when you get it approved.
Okay.
Would be the way I would interpret that, because all of our 8-week monitoring period, we consider everything from the date they close. The funds are supposed to be dispersed all at the same time on the date of closing. So I would believe it would be the date of closing is that trigger date. You get the money, you can't have the PUA anymore. Okay. After that date, you move to the PPP.
And of course, I just realized Paul's left, so I'll send him an email.
Okay.
Okay. And then I think we're past the hour mark, but we have. Oh, Paul, you're still here. Great. Oh, there you are. I'm just not observant.
Okay.
So great. I hope you heard Susan's answer. Tavernier has asked, can EIDL be adjusted after approval but prior to signing the loan paperwork?
With the EIDL loan, what typically happens is it'll come to you and it will say, you are approved to this much. How much do you want? And that's where that sliding scale will come in. If you want less than that, you can slide the scale down, and that is the amount that you'd be closing on. I think that answers that.
Okay.
So it would be after approval, but you know, it's not after you close. You'd want to do it before you close. You want to do it when you get that first email, and you do not have to close right away. You do not have to close right away. You have, I believe it's 60 days to finish off the documentation. You want to make sure you open up that email and create that portal so you can go in and see it, but you don't actually have to close the loan for 60 days.
The term on those, it's a 5-year, right? No, wait, it's longer.
No, 30.
Yeah, okay.
It's a 30.
It's
a 30.
At 3.75%.
For a for-profit, yes.
And,
Nonprofits are less.
and under 25, there's no personal guarantee or collateral requirements.
Right.
Right.
It's a big difference between the two programs.
Yeah.
Really big difference. And I will just remind everybody, if you get both, which you can have, you want to make sure you use them for different purposes. The PPP is really best used to keep your people on payroll. And because the EIDL loan, you have a lot more variety of uses you can use it for. For example, you can make a principal and interest mortgage payment with the money, and you can't do that with a PPP. You can only use PPP funds for the interest portions. So there's limited things that you can use the funds for in a PPP that you can use an EIDL for. So an EIDL, you can use the money to buy inventory. You can use it for general operating expenses. If you have a mortgage payment that's due, you can make the principal and interest portion. For a PPP loan, those non-payroll eligible uses are limited to the rent, utilities, and interest on mortgage and debt obligations. And a lot of people ask us more questions about what those exactly are, and the presentations that I have for the forgiveness fill that out a little bit more. But that is something that I always make sure people realize, is that you cannot use the PPP for principal at all. You cannot prepay, you cannot pay off debt, you cannot do anything like that with those funds. You can only get forgiven the interest portion on those obligations, as long as the obligations were established before the pandemic.
Okay. Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining us once again. You probably joined us, I don't know, maybe in our third webinar, third or fourth, I think it was. So it feels like forever ago, but thanks again. My notes,
You're welcome.
My notes are the following. 60/40 is the ratio to watch, and potentially if you go with the 60/40, there might not be any forgiveness. Safe harbor might be extended to December 31st of this year. There are a few exceptions relative to or related to if you have employees that won't come back due to a number of reasons. There may be some exceptions provided to folks. Tax deductibility, so if that's a consideration, keep an eye on that. And then lastly, stay tuned for the clarifications in the rules and attend Susan's daily forgiveness webinars. But those are my high-level notes from your comments today. So thank you so much. Again, folks, you can email me at BDCC COVID-19-questions@brattleborodevelopment.com so that we can answer your questions. I appreciate your attendance, Susan, and Ted's, I believe, already gone. But Ted, thank you so much for joining us. And we're gonna call it a session. Have a great weekend, folks. Take care.